Hi everybody, it's Stuart Hillard here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now in today's video, I'm going to treat this as a skill builder session, and today's video is all about how to bind your quilts and your placemats and your table runners and those sort of quilted projects. When you've finished your quilt and you've got your layers, your top, your batting and your backing all quilted together, you're going to end up with a kind of raw edge all the way around that needs covering. And typically on a quilt, this is covered with a binding. The binding strip is cut typically at 2.5 inches wide, and you'll almost certainly have to join some of these strips together in order to make your binding strip long enough to go all the way around a quilt. I always like to join my binding strips using a diagonal seam. I have shown you before on my YouTube channel how to do that diagonal seam. So if you're not sure, watch the video for how to make the Danish woven hearts quilt, and I show you there how to do a diagonal seam. Now, once that's done, you're going to fold and press your strip of fabric, your binding, in half. And you want that with the wrong side to wrong side. So in other words, wherever you've got seam allowances, they should be enclosed once you've pressed it, and you shouldn't be able to see them. The other thing that you want to do is at the very end of your binding strip, you want to cut the end off at a 45-degree angle. And I like that 45-degree angle to go in the same direction as all of my diagonal seams throughout the rest of my binding strip. It gives a really nice, neat finish, and it means that it's very difficult to spot where you've started and finished. And what I've also done with that diagonal cut is I have folded over about 3/8 of an inch to the wrong side and pressed it. And then I've pressed the whole thing in half to create my binding. And it's got a nice neatened end. Now then, I've got my quilted project right here. And in this instance, it's a table mat. And I've trimmed it back. So it's all trimmed, nice and neat and square, and it's ready for binding. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with that neatened edge. So that's the edge that I cut at a 45-degree angle and pressed. And I'm going to find somewhere on one of the sides, not right at the very corner. I generally like to start about 2 or 3 inches down from that corner. So you can see I've just attached it here. It's about 2 or 3 inches down from the top corner, and I've pinned it in place. Again, my pin isn't right at the very end. It's about another 2 or 3 inches down from that neatened edge. And this is the point where I'm going to start sewing. I've aligned the raw edges of my binding with the raw edges of my quilt that needs to be bound. I'm going to start sewing right here, and I'm going to sew down towards that corner. And I'm going to stop sewing 1/4 of an inch before I get to the very end to that corner. And I'm going to back stitch there. So let's stitch that first. Now I have put red thread into the top of my sewing machine because I want you to be able to see where I'm sewing. When you're binding a quilt at home, I really want you to use a thread which tones, matches, blends with your fabric. I wouldn't ever normally do red thread with cream fabric, but I really want you to see what I'm doing. So I'm sewing all the way down, and I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch before I get to the bottom raw edge of my quilt. Now on most sewing machine 1/4 inch feet, you will have little notches along the side of your foot which show you there'll be a little notch for the position of the needle, and then there'll be a little notch or a mark 1/4 of an inch in front and a little notch 1/4 of an inch behind. So when that notch that's 1/4 of an inch in front of the needle is level with the bottom edge of your quilt, that's when you stop and take a back stitch or two, and then take your quilt out, and then I will show you what I've done. So you can see there I've sewn 1/4 of an inch seam down, and then just 1/4 of an inch before the very bottom I've done a little back stitch, and I've left a little 1/4 inch gap. Now we're going to miter the corners and turn the corner. And I'm going to hold this up so you can see how to do it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is my binding strip, I'm going to fold upwards like this, out of the way, okay? And that forms a diagonal line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the binding back down on itself. So there's a little folded edge, you can just about see it there, a little folded edge of the binding that's now level with the top, this edge that I've already bound. And then I'm going to lay the binding strip down, so again that 1/4 inch, or that raw edge rather, that raw edge of the binding is level with my next side to be bound. And I'm going to pop a pin just to hold that in place. Now I'm going to start stitching 1/4 inch down from the top and carry on sewing my binding on. So again, if you're looking at the notches on your 1/4 inch foot, this is the notch behind the needle. So sew down on that same side. And we're going to sew to 1/4 inch before the end. So look for that front notch on your foot and then back stitch. So again, I'm going to hold this up so you can see. I started sewing 1/4 inch down from the top, and I've sewn all the way down, and I have finished 1/4 inch before the bottom. Now I'm going to turn my work. So this is the edge that I have just bound. And I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to lift my binding up and out of the way. And that forms a little diagonal fold right here. And then I'm going to hold that at the top, and I'm going to fold the binding back down on top of itself. So there is just a little fold at the top that's level with the raw edge of my quilt. And then I'm going to pin and sew again, starting 1/4 inch in from that raw edge, and you're going to keep going like this until you've sewn all 4 miters. So what you can see here is I've sewn on this side of the binding, raw edges aligned of my binding and my quilt. I've sewn to 1/4 inch before this new side, and I've back stitched and clipped my thread. So now I'm going to show you how to miter that corner again. So I'm going to take my binding strip and I'm going to fold it up and out of the way. And it'll kind of pull on that last stitch. You can just see that last stitch peeping out here. And when it's pulled right up, nice and tight, it will form a 45-degree fold here. And you can probably also notice that the raw edge of the binding is in a perfectly straight line with this new edge that's just waiting to be bound. That's a brilliant sign. So keep that fold in place, and then you're going to grab that binding and you're going to fold it back down on top of itself. What you want to form really here is a fold that is level with the edge that you just bound. So this edge is level, this new edge is level, raw edge to raw edge, and then we're just going to stick a pin through the whole thing. You're going to start sewing 1/4 inch down from the fold. And if you need a little visual reference, just look to your left. You'll see that seam allowance right there. If your first stitch is level with these stitches here, when you sew down, you'll be right on the money. Now, I've gone round all 4 corners and I've made all of my miters. If you can see that little folded corner there, that's another great sign that everything looks right. So the last thing that we need to do is just finish off the end and the beginning. Now, the way I like to do that is simply to overlap them, and that's what we're going to do. We've already neatened this edge. We folded it over and pressed it before we started. And what I'm going to do is just bring this edge down, and I just want to make sure I've got about 1/2 to 3/4 inch overlap. And I'm just going to trim that extra binding off. So you can see we've got a little bit of overlap there. It's probably about 1/2 inch. And then I'm just going to open this up and tuck this inside. Make sure everything's nice and smooth and flat. And then I'm simply going to pin in a couple of places to hold everything nice and flat. So all I've got to do now is stitch this final part of the seam, and I'll be ready to turn my binding over to the other side. Now, while we're here, I'm going to show you how we do that. So here we've got our binding already added round the corner. And when you push this back, what we've got is a lovely clean line. We've got our beautifully mitered corner right here. And if we flip this to the wrong side, this is going to fold over and bind the edge. This is going to fold over and bind this edge. And here at the corner, it'll form a mitre on both the front and the back. And all we're going to do then to finish this off is hand sew using small invisible stitches all the way around to attach the binding to the back. So we'll have a lovely, clean, bound edge on the front and a really nice, neat bound edge on the back. So that's how to bind your quilt or your placemats or your runners quickly and easily. And if you want a machine sewn version, you could turn your binding to the back and then sew using your machine really, really close to this edge from the top. And what that will do is catch that binding onto the back. So you can sew your binding on by machine, both front and back if you prefer, but hand sewing it to the back is a neater and more invisible finish. Thanks for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. This was a skill builder learning how to sew a binding to a quilt. I hope you'll remember to join me next time for another quilting video, and I hope to see you really regularly. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.